How's it going, everyone? Hope you're having a great time at this conference. And before I begin, can we just have another round of applause for these wonderful presentations? So my presentation, It Makes Monsters of Us All, is about how Guillermo del Toro, who you might know as the Oscar-winning director of Shape of Water, his 2015 film Crimson Peak deals with the ongoing debate around the concept of power feminism for which its antagonist, Lucille Sharp. Let me just quickly run down what power feminism is all about. So, power feminism is a concept which became popular in the 1990s, and in which, to combat patriarchal forces, women would use their sexuality as terrorism and become, instead of the submissive victim, the dominating victimizer. So as feminist critic and very influential Gothic author Angela Carter puts it, a power feminist is a woman who acts according to the precepts and practices of a man's world. And so she does not suffer, instead she causes suffering. Now what does this concept have to do with Guillermo del Toro in his film Crimson Peak? Well, you see, power feminism was created in response to a competing feminist ideology known as victim feminism. Now I have a much larger paper talking in great depth about this subject, but for the sake of time, this presentation, what is important to note is that this competing ideology, victim feminism, was criticized by these power feminists for its inherent lack of female agency. And what is also important to note is that this competing ideology finds its origins within early Gothic literature. Now, when Crimson Peak first came out in 2015, Del Toro tweeted the following: "Crimson Peak is not a horror film. It is a Gothic romance. Creepy, tense, but full of emotion. Like my dancing." Del Toro clearly is a big fan of the Gothic genre, and this is evident within Crimson Peak. Now, for those who haven't seen it, which based off of box office numbers is most of you, Crimson Peak is a film about Edith Cushing, who is a young Gothic writer played by, sorry if I butchered this, Maya Wasikowska, who finds herself confined within her new husband's ancestral home, Crimson Peak. Our protagonist, Edith, is trapped within this ancient manor, and on top of all of that, she finds out that her sister-in-law, Lucille Sharp, played by Jessica Chastain, is trying to kill her. Del Toro puts Gothic references everywhere within this movie. As described within an analysis by Gothic scholar Bernice Murphy, the film's narrative structure closely resembles the checklist of the plot points found in the then popular modern Gothic romance paperbacks. In fact, the film's protagonist was clearly inspired by the Gothic heroines of old, be that her tendency to brandish a candelabra and explore dim, decrepit castle hallways, is in a long flowing robe, her name Edith Cushing, which is an obvious homage to the famous female Gothicist Edith Wharton, or even the fact that she as a character wishes to become a Gothicist herself. So there's Gothic references everywhere. But while Edith is subversive in her own right, her subversions being, of course, the focus of my more expansive paper, for the purposes of this talk, I wish not to focus on Edith, but on the film's antagonist, Lucille Sharp. Lucille is the embodiment of power feminism. She is a power feminist incarnate, dominating the patriarchal forces in her life before they could do the same to her. After all, she does take this ideology to its logical extreme, brutally killing our protagonist's domineering father, who is emphasized by his burly beard and masculine beard, as well as position as a head of a major steelworks company, stands as a clear patriarchal figure. Similarly, her tendency of male domination reveals itself in subtler ways than straight-up murder, such as in her relationship with her brother and lover, Thomas Sharp, who is played by Tom Hiddleston. In short, despite being a woman in the patriarchal era which she lives in, which is around the late 1800s to the early 1900s, Lucille is the dominant figure within her relationship with Thomas. Thomas, and as revealed in the story that Lucille tells Edith about her childhood, this dominant role has always been the case. Lucille says, "You should have seen him as a child, Thomas. He was perfect," infantilizing Thomas within this process. Following this infantilization, she tells Edith, "And for every small infraction from Mother's Cain, I protected him. I took so many beatings." Now, by establishing herself as the protector within this of her weak, infantile brother, a dynamic which is gendered is traditionally reversed. Now, think of, let's say, an older brother protecting his younger sister, or maybe a chivalrous knight protecting a princess. As Lucille clearly establishes herself as the dominant figure within her relationship with Thomas, putting her in line with the power feminist philosophy of male domination. But it's clear within the film that Del Toro sees the limits of power feminism. And he's not the first one to see this. You see, Angela Carter herself did so before him, when she observed that power feminists, rather than creating their own power, are just borrowing from the same masculine forces they seek to break free from. By playing the same game as the patriarchy, she argued, power feminists are stuck within the same oppressive system. Now, while this is already a very critical perspective of power feminism, Del Toro takes this criticism even further, showing through this character of Lucille that the power feminist does not break away from patriarchal oppression, but instead, ironically, becomes a surrogate for it, thus becoming as equally detrimental to women as the patriarchy. Lucille, who, as we established, is a character that follows this power feminist ideology to a monstrous extreme, consumes the freedom and lives of the poor women who are kept under her care, becoming just as much of a victimizer to these women as the patriarchy. While as the primary antagonist of Crimson Peak, Lucille's victimization of women is riddled within the film's narrative, her killing multiple women throughout it. It is no more exemplified than a confrontation she has for her protagonist Edith near the film's end, where while forcing the now injured Edith into signing away her property, she explains her brutal history of brutalizing women for her own gain. The scene begins with Lucille burning Edith's Gothic writing, a form of writing which was a tool for women at the time to break free from patriarchal oppression. Lucille smirks, throwing this manuscript into the fire, thus establishing herself, even in the scene's beginning, as a sort of quasi-patriarchal figure who stands in opposition to the idea of female agency. In fact, Lucille's behavior as a conduit for patriarchal oppression is further emphasized through her physical actions during the scene. To illustrate, we watch as Lucille cuts off the lock of her protagonist's hair. The inherent victimization of this act being further emphasized by how the tear Edith sheds in response to this action is placed center frame during a close-up of her face, thus forcing us to focus in on it during the brief time it's there. Later, Lucille takes this hair, and we watch as she goes through the process of braiding it, finally placing the now braided hair in her drawer among a collection of the hair of her prior female victims. Likewise, long hair is traditionally associated with feminine characteristics. Thus, in a sense, by collecting her victim's hair, Lucille is collecting tokens of her victim's femininity. And in doing so, just like a patriarchal figure, she objectifies these women, reducing them to little more than objects that she can own. This objectification and subsequent ownership is even further emphasized by what is located right next to Lucille's collection of hair, 2 butterflies trapped in a jar. Indeed, just like these butterflies that Lucille collects, the women whom Lucille objectifies try their best to be free, but they ultimately fail to break free from her oppressive hold. In closing, as Del Toro mentioned in his tweet, Crimson Peak is indeed not just a horror film. It takes on a critical debate about feminism and how to defeat patriarchy. For the character of Lucille Sharp, Del Toro shows that any ideology that oppresses as its primary tool will ultimately oppress entirely. Thus, the power feminist ideology which she represents is ultimately just as counterintuitive, if not more so, to the goal of female agency as its predecessor, both failing to grant true agency.